Hello there, namaste. So this is the Unmaking of India, and I've watched one like this before. I think this is more like a revised version with new information and a lot of the same information. So it'll be like a recap for me in some aspects and then a lot of new stuff in other aspects. So yeah, let's check this out. Let's see what's new and if I can even tell what's new.
In the year 1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined. 250 years later, India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished. What happened? Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India. In 1707 CE, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, and
the East India Trading Company was already embedded there. They had been working with the Mughal Empire for a while.
Endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, regional powers jostle for supremacy, land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation is so precarious that in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger to dealing with foreign aggression, but the British were not like those who had come before. They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and...
Yeah, they came as benefactors. That's always what is this? There's always a saying about fearing the one who comes bearing gifts rather than the one who comes bearing a sword. There's something about those who claim to want to aid and support. Always be iffy about those.
Simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy de-industrialized, its trade networks severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade. The halcyon days of...
It's so fascinating to actually learn the true history, because the thing is, Britain became like a world superpower. Is that the correct term? Yeah, it became the world superpower and basically started re-influencing and re-educating, which is the real terms, because they were, well, the victors. They could re-influence and re-educate and, yeah, to change people's minds and make people think, oh, this is right. This is what happened. I'm pretty sure most Europeans at the time thought they were bringing civilization to the world instead of, oh, the fact that we're strip mining other places to get richer ourselves. It's like, yeah. It's fascinating to actually learn the history. You need to know both sides. And in the end, what side of history is telling the truth? Because everyone shades it in shades. There's always tales. Like, I'm pretty sure it's always the impoverished ones that tell the real story to what happened, like what happened to them, rather than hearing, oh, things are going great, we're doing this. No, talk to the person who, well, that's being done to. And you'll learn like another side. Of course, it's not sugar-coated, but skewed in their perspective, the negative, not any of the positives that might possibly come. But in this case, it's primarily all negative. India was strip mined of everything they could possibly see value in, only left when they realized it was costing them more to keep it afloat and remain there than it was to just let it go. I mean, that's the only reason they left. Other than that, they would have remained if they saw value in it. Let's be honest. There would have been no independence if Britain still saw value in maintaining a stronghold in India. But India was ruined of everything they believed, so they took off. That's honestly what it was. It was never humanity. It was never seeing the fact that, oh, people need to be treated as equals. I'm pretty sure it was never that. When it comes to making money, it's always about making money. I'm pretty sure I'd fall victim to that. Oh gosh, I hope not. I kind of just want to be getting by. That's what I want. I want to just get by. But oh my gosh, it's disgusting when you learn more about the world and the fact that in the end we all have the same kind of vices that make us, that corrupt us and bring us down. And you need to have a moral not superiority. That again goes into an issue of thinking you're better than, but a moral structure that keeps you grounded in the fact that, I go off on topics like this, but it is fascinating to actually learn not the true history, but the history that has been hidden, I'd say.
India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history. So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics.
Still is, kind of. I mean, heck, most of the gold around the world is still manufactured in India. It's still made there by the artisans and then shipped out and sold. I mean, I've seen the South Park episode, which has the cycle of gold making. It's sold to old people who buy it for their young ones. The young ones sell it at a gold shop. The gold shop sends it back to India. India melts it down and recreates it, reforges it into something else, and then it goes back again. It is absolutely hilarious, but there's truth to it. There's truth to it.
So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world.
Ooh, still.
She had great merchants, businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries. That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century. This thriving textile trade had knock-on effects for the entire economy. For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost. As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry. We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry. Dhaka, Masulipatam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the...
See, that's the thing. It's beautiful seeing the cause and effect. Like there's what is it in like marketing and what's the word for like corporations? Like there is something you have that is worth value, and that one thing can create opportunities elsewhere. So the fabric is worth a fortune. So they need to build ships. So there's a massive ship trade, and they get to invest in that. Builds in a massive ship trading, a ship building and the docking and everything, which grows onto the fact that they have their own ships. They can do their own trading. Other artisans are able to sell on top of the fact because no ship is going to take just cloth. They want to get a multitude of incomes, so they'll take a variety of values and sell it all at once because it's worth more to them than just being like, here's the fabric. Even though the fabric probably sells the most, it's nice to have other things to bring people's eyes. Because when you walk into, like, let's say there's an electronics store and all you see in the store windows is, well, HDMI cables. Are you going to go in there to look at it? No. You want to see variety of stuff. You want to see like the newest phone. You want to see a laptop. You want to see a tower. You want to see cables here. You want to see the opportunities abound. You want to know there's more options there. It piques your interest. That you're like, oh, there's this here. What else is inside? That's a way to sell, and it basically created more opportunities for other people. Yeah. And then, of course, another empire saw the value in all of that and decided to take control.
Production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century. The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to 500 tons of goods. These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference. India was a longtime pioneer in the global steel industry. As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India. While these blades were purchased as wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace. Though we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves.
Yep.
And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests. The first step? Dismantling all native industry. To start, they established a legal monopoly over Indian textile goods and cut off the export market, which immediately disrupted long-standing trade links. Having now made themselves the exclusive buyers of Indian textiles, the British then changed the way that they paid for those goods. Instead of using foreign currency, they paid using the tax revenues extracted from India. The Indian economy stagnated and prices collapsed. Skilled artisans, who once fueled the vibrant Indian economic engine, were now significantly poorer and more restricted than ever before. And it didn't stop there. Soon enough, British manufacturers lobbied their government to completely eliminate the competition from the Indian textile industry. See, despite the restrictions imposed on Indian industry, British manufacturers were still finding it difficult to compete with Indian products. Company soldiers were sent to smash Indian looms. According to several different accounts, they even went around breaking the thumbs of weavers so that they could no longer ply their trade. But that's not all. To ensure that the Indian textile industry could not recover, adapt, or innovate itself back into relevancy, the British imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly every branch of manufacturing in India. India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore, so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial de-industrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture. Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax cultivators as the primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income, and calculated before the harvest. The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers. To add insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament. The Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort. Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not negotiate tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of...
Of course not, because they didn't see them as like a lot of crap is said about the U.S. and how they treated people when they made it to the U.S. and just like, well, there are a lot of true facts that have been swayed in so disease wasn't known as well, especially when you go to a brand new continent that had never had a cold, or you're trying to be polite and give them a blanket, but you didn't know how disease transferred. And then a civilization that has never had that disease before, it'll infect it, and it basically becomes like a chemical warfare at that point, which you know nothing about. You can't blame a group of people for just trying to be polite. And then there is like what Britain did to India, where they just decided to deprive, and what happened in the U.S., where they saw themselves as United States citizens and integrated with the society and brought civilization, as barbaric as that sounds when you are one of the people. I am Native American, but at the same time, I am American. There's no real difference at this point in time. I know how my grandmother was treated, I guess, and how I came about to be here. I know the history of it, and I'm not going to give it praise when it's not entirely worth praise. It's just what happens. History happens, life happens, and at least the United States decided to create something of the nation they had founded. Imagine if Britain decided to create something, integrate with the community that was there. Sure, years later it would be, let's say at that point in time they started integrating immediately. They started seeing them as civilized human beings. They started blending in with the culture. What would India become? It would have probably ended up closing itself off, kind of like what the U.S. did, because they're getting taxed elsewhere. But no, you had stationary people who saw themselves as different, who saw themselves as superior, who saw themselves as not wanting to be there. Heck, that went on for years, even way after. And even other nations did the same thing. When they would go there and just see themselves, it's just so strange. You know, you need to integrate with cultures. You need to understand where you are, where you're going, where the world comes from. It's just, yeah. But I've seen this. I don't think anything is new. But yeah. It's always so fascinating to just watch it and just, yeah, the history is so jaded by one side.
Sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have the means to pay, the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's largest source of revenue by far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers, and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquess of Salisbury, himself admitted, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested." And just like that, India and its people were bled dry. The fundamental issue of British overlordship was the fact that the British had no intention to become one with the land or to rule it as their own. The British saw India as innately and eternally foreign, and this justified their creation and maintenance of what scholars have referred to as an extractive colony. For comparison's sake, consider the Turkic peoples who invaded India and eventually formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Look, the Mughals were no heroes. They imposed unequal taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, plundered local treasuries, visited great violence upon their enemies, and exhibited a Persianized racial arrogance. But one thing is clear. India's wealth was preserved at a foundational level.
And they integrated. Again, the key factor is you integrate. It's seeing like what Britain did is absolutely one of the most barbaric things possible. And it still happens to this day. I mean, heck, the U.S. outsources most of its companies because its companies a company can't afford to have a manufacturing. Well, it could. It just won't make as much money here in the U.S. So they'll put it in other nations where it's far cheaper. And look at what the gas leak that happened, that disaster. Well, they don't have to care. The same rights that happen here in the U.S. where certain laws are put in place, certain things. Well, they don't have to care about it elsewhere. That's the problem with the corporate entity, the mindset where it's a great thing, but it becomes destructive. Power corrupts. Absolutely. The influence of money, the love of money is the root of all evil. The love of money. Money, it's not money, it's the love of it. The yearning for more, demand and wanting more of it. And it's just like what Britain did was just wanted it all. Nothing went back into the economy, which is what is needed. It needs to thrive. In order to continue draining something, you have to continuously, well, they figured out a way for a long time of just constantly draining and draining and draining and draining. Just pay the right officials, have the right people on your side. And yeah, it was basically a slave nation. I guess that's the best term to put.
2 centuries of Mughal rule, India was still a dominant economic power, responsible for 27% of global trade. There's a simple reason for that. See, the Mughals had a foreign place of origin, Fergana, but they did not repatriate India's resources to their original homeland. India may not have been Fergana, but it had become their new home, and so their loyalties and energies were owed solely to India. Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No. It was extracted and repatriated to their distant, foggy homeland. How much? Modern economists have estimated that the total amount of wealth that the British extracted from India is in the ballpark of $43 trillion.
That's basically US's debt.
$43 trillion. When taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised, they constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Apologists for colonial rule often point to the railways as some sort of extravagant counter to the argument of extraction and divestment. But as modern scholars have pointed out,
the railways, there's nothing great about a railway system. The fact that you use the Indian labor in order to build it. You used slave labor in order to build it. They either were going to get taxed for doing, or you forced them to do it, and they can continue to live. There is no positive out of this. There's no trying to say, oh, at least we did this. No. The railway system, even the railway system here in the U.S. was built on the backs of we had Chinese slaves and things like that. They weren't slaves. They were indentured servants. And there's something to be said about like indentured servitude. But where does that cross the line into how do you maintain people and make sure they're doing what is expected of them in that? But yeah. The counter argument is we built a railroad.
The railways serve as evidence for how exploitative and inefficient British investment in India really was. First, there's the bold assumption that Indians would not have built railways, like the Japanese or others, either by importing the technology or by developing their own. India had been far too advanced and cutting edge of civilization to not keep up had it been given the opportunity to do so. When the British came to India, the country was the leader of Asiatic civilization. Japan was nowhere. Now, in 50 years, Japan has revolutionized her history with the aid of modern arts of progress, and India, burdened by 150 years of English rule, is condemned to tutelage. But let's ignore that.
Yeah, because what was Japan was guided and given support and aided. They weren't mined of all their resources. There was a established respect and trade. but it was the primarily the U.S. that was making deals with Japan at that point in time, the early period. And yeah, it's just it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. The fact that they're like, oh, they wouldn't have figured it out. No, you didn't bring anything. You didn't bring anything.
For now. Initially, the Indian railways were positioned as a grand investment scheme for British shareholders. The government guaranteed substantial returns of at least 5% per year. And when the revenues were not enough to pay out these returns, Indian taxpayers covered all the losses. Because of these taxpayer-backed guarantees, construction of the railways was extremely inefficient. Here's a fun stat. Every mile of Indian rail cost £18,000 to construct, as compared to £2,000 for the same mile built in the United States. All the elements of railway construction, steel, wagons, gears, engines, and more, were produced by British manufacturers. Indians weren't even given an opportunity to produce their own manufactured alternatives because the British government imposed restrictions that prevented Indians from competing. Worse still, the essential purpose of the railways was to assist the British enterprise in the exploitation of the natural resources of India. In fact, the railways made it possible for the British to export enormous amounts of grain and other agricultural products, which sparked and exacerbated famines. Over the course of British rule in India, an estimated 35 million preventable deaths were caused by famines. That's millions more than those killed under Stalin or Mao, and that's 5 times more than the Holocaust. The British were directly responsible for this. They mass exported Indian foodstuffs to Britain and other countries in Europe, even during drought periods. Food in India became too expensive for peasants to afford. According to Dr. Charles Hall, India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There is plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. The British had no interest in provisioning for Indian lives. Famine non-intervention was official government policy. How ironic, given that heavy-handed British intervention and market manipulation is what sparked the famines in the first place. And when good people, Indians and foreigners, worked together to help famine-affected peasants, the British government made efforts to stop them. They were furious that the government's own failures were being highlighted. Don't believe me? Listen to this British officer in his own words. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands flung their wives into ponds to escape the torment of seeing them perish from hunger. But amid these scenes of death, the British government in India was unmoved. Newspapers were persuaded into silence. Strict orders were given to civilians. Do not acknowledge that civilians are dying of hunger. And if you think that Indians would have done a worse job, consider this. There hasn't been a single large-scale Indian famine in the 70-plus years since British rule ended. Not one. Independent India has its flaws, but it has been overwhelmingly better
Every nation has
providing
its
for the
flaws.
care, safety, and prosperity of its own people.
Yeah. I've seen this. I've definitely seen this before. It's the same exact one. There's no difference. I thought it was going to be a bit different, but no, it's the same one. But it is fascinating to watch again and just have more insight with the other stuff I've watched, to like the Indianization. You learn about that, and the fact that India was basically the world superpower. I can't say the U.S. of the world, because the U.S. is no longer the world superpower. That was true 40 years ago. Yeah, but that's long since expired. I mean, the last time we really had any stake in the world was during the Cold War. But yeah, it was the world superpower, and it got taken advantage of. The fact that there was infighting, struggle, the fact that a ruler passed away and then everyone was fighting for it. I think that's why India decided to become more of a democracy than anything, where it's people are elected into it, because you have to get away from, as I say it, but let's face it, it turns back into not a dictatorship, monarchy. It turns back into a monarchy over time, because the U.S. started off as a democracy. People were elected into power. The problem is, when people never work a day in their life and they're used to a certain way of life, which somehow they do. Like I say in some of my other videos, like if you look up the U.S. Political landscape and you see how everyone like who they're related to, who they're married to. You start realizing that everyone in politics is, well, it's a monarchy. They're all related to one another in one way or another. That's why everyone was so mad when Orange Man bad, because, well, he wasn't related to anyone in the family. He was an outsider. No one wants an outsider on the seat of power. Everyone wants to have their own family member on the seat of power. So everyone's okay when certain people... It's absolutely disturbing when you start looking into it and just realizing that, okay, give it a few hundred years and it turns back into a monarchy because the people in power want to remain in power. They want to have their kids in power. They want to remain better off. You know, there's an issue when people who are supposed to be servants of the public are wealthier than, well, everyone. How can you be a servant of the public and be worth millions, sometimes billions? Well, because your foundations are frauds. Not 90% of what your you know, when you do a foundation, like to donate for like poverty-stricken kids or things like that, 90% goes into the benefactor's pocket, and only 10% probably makes it to the starving child. I mean, that's literally how it goes. You have these foundations for politicians so that way they can help the world when it primarily goes into their pocket. There are statistics and things like that. It's just absolutely disgusting. But it's fascinating how it went from a world superpower, but because it was a monarchy and like this, apparently the Mughal king passed away, and everyone fought for the throne. It just disabled itself. And the problem was the East India Trading Company actually had a foothold at that point in time beforehand. So Britain did have an in and knew about the political landscape. They had deals with the East India Trading Company themselves. They could hear word of mouth of what's going on. So they found the perfect time to take over. And the issue is they never integrated themselves. Sure, they would probably be always seen as outsider. Like right now, there are still like integral Native American communities that say they're the only true Americans. And I'm just like, the issue with that is we're supposed to integrate with cultures. I'm a third generation, I think. My grandmother was 100%. So I'm third. Yeah, I think that's right. And it's just like you integrate with others. You adapt. You grow. You become one. And that's what Britain never did. And that's like the Native Americans who claim to be 100% Native American and close themselves off from everyone else. It's like the Amish. You end up inbreeding and yeah, but that just went weird. But yeah, you have to integrate cultures. The world is too small not to realize, especially now. Like, given the time when Britain did it, maybe it's understandable. But now that the world is so small, it becomes very weird when you start hearing people talk closed-minded, and I fall victim of it too. Let's face it, I have my own thoughts and processes, and for my fiance, I go on tirade about how simple-minded I am, but she's probably the only one that probably would. I try to be kind of concrete and sound most of the time, because it does, yeah. People just, we need unification and understanding of the world, because everyone is different. Everyone is different. Everyone is like they're. The stuff that I'm dealing with right now is like, there's some of my family members who view, well, where I'm taking my wedding at as like the worst place in the world, because that's all they believe. Like my father, who comes from Mexico, believes Mexico is a dangerous place, because that's he knows the history of Mexico. But there are some people who in America who believe Mexico is an amazing place, because they would only go to the tourist sites. They'd never go into the rural areas. They'd go to but it's just it's like sad to realize that it's just like the world's so close-minded. And I even have family who refuses to accept the fact that, well, India isn't what they believe it to be, because they assume it's they assume the worst. And I'm just like, it's so simple-minded, and it's hard to talk to people who have set themselves up as that. And it's just like, you know what, let them do them. I'll continue being happy, living my life, and I'm going back to India pretty soon. But yeah, integration is always key when it comes to rulership. That sounds so wrong, but it does sound right. It's justified. It's justified because you need to be able to relate to the people you're with. Just like the issue I have with politicians. The reason why I dislike politics, absolutely, is because none of them can relate to me. Not a single one has ever known, especially, well, except for one who got ousted and is trying to get back into politics, doesn't know what it's like to be a labor, like someone to work with their hands, someone to work a hard day's work. I mean, heck, even most streamers who make it famous before they're 20 don't know what it's like to work a day in their life, because they don't have to worry about that. It's strange to hear people try to talk out of your mindset, like try to talk and relate to you. And they're like, oh, we need these policies. It's just like, well, this doesn't help anyone. You're wanting to help illegal immigrants when we have U.S. veterans who are starving to death. You have U.S. veterans who are living on the streets. Yet you want to help these illegal immigrants maintain a residency in a nation they're not allowed. They got to illegally. My father got here legally. But yeah, I could go on a tirade when it comes to politics. I'm sorry, but this is fascinating. I'm glad I rewatched this. I am. Thank you all for watching. As I watch more and learn more, it becomes easier to start to connect the dots in the timeline, because I am terrible when it comes to dates and understanding where the timeline goes. But as learning more, it's like, okay, they'll mention one thing about the Mughals, and I was like, oh, okay, I remember learning about them having control at a certain point in time. Okay, so the East India Trading Company was during that period, and then I was like, okay, Britain took over shortly after. I need to have a visual in my mind, because you give me numbers, I'm lost. I won't remember. But you give me an actual incident and everything like that, it's easier for me to cling on to it and be like, oh, okay, this is the order of events, because I know the Mughals came after this. I know this, you know. But yeah, thank you all for watching. I'm definitely glad I rewatched this. Doodles.